So some of this stuff will look a little bit familiar from the sense that Steve was talking about similar kinds of efforts that the USGS has been undergoing. And I'd definitely like to point out that folks like the USGS and other state and federal agencies have been collecting a huge amount of data across the entire High Plains region for decades. And that really enabled us to first target a study in this region, and I'll explain it a little bit more in a minute, that really just mostly focuses on synthesis and modeling rather than data collection, which is a fairly new direction for hydrologic sciences to move. I also want to point out, this is work, obviously, that I conduct with a lot of other people. You'll see that. But primarily, I work with Dr. David Heineman also at the MSU Hydrogeology Lab. So just a little bit of background. This is, again, going to be fairly familiar. Here's a map that I produced using data from the USGS and Kansas Geological Survey, Texas Water Development Board, and others. And what it shows is essentially the percent decline since pre-development of the water table, or of the High Plains aquifer. And we've seen some things like this, similar types of maps showing that the southern High Plains areas as much as 75% decline. Whereas places, and there's a gradient across now the central High Plains in northern Texas and Kansas, up to places in the northern High Plains where we actually see increasing water levels. And we saw some of this in the data that Steve presented, that actually some of these water tables have increased and led to increasing base flow levels over the last several decades. So the issues, particularly in the southern High Plains and the central High Plains, as well as localized areas within the northern High Plains, have brought about a lot of attention from all levels of decision making and production on how can we manage this resource in a more sustainable fashion. And one of the things that we realized early on in the project was that the word sustainability carries a lot of weight, and it carries a lot of connotation to different listeners. And here we really mean sustainable in the sense of maintaining the economic benefit that irrigation water use provides to growers, as well as obviously there are other benefits that water has as a resource, but in terms of a holistic view of sustainability that does take into account the economic use as well. Persistent droughts are common across the region, and there's more and more evidence from the literature that suggests that the kinds of droughts that we've seen recently are actually more the norm rather than having several decades between deep droughts. Especially during the early 1900s, when a lot of flow regulations and things were set for various interstate compacts, that was historically likely a fairly wet time, and that's something that we're learning. This map that I'm showing is just a map of 15 years of UNL drought monitor data. How many years was each particular location within severe or worse drought conditions? And so you can see that most of the aquifer has been in severe or worse drought 3 or more years out of the last 15. And that obviously has pretty significant consequences. Also within the region and across most of the United States, climate change forecasts look to increase temperatures over the next century, as well as affect precipitation. I'll first talk about the map on the right. So temperature changes are something that climate model forecasts agree on a little bit more uniformly than the precipitation forecasts. So the particular map I'm showing you, I've just downloaded 24 climate model forecasts under a particular scenario called RCP 6.0. RCP 6.0 is, and I'll show you a plot of temperature forecasts according to these models, but it's more or less it's a measure of emissions growth and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions that looks like about what we're doing under business as usual conditions. So this map just shows temperature changes anywhere from 3 to 4 degrees Celsius over the next century, or over a 1 century period. On the left is the numbers are the ratio of 2090's precipitation to 1990's precipitation. So numbers greater than 1, there's an increase in precipitation forecast according to this average of all models, and numbers less than 1 suggest a decrease in precip. And again, this is something where there's a lot bigger spread among the models, and so we recognize certainly that precipitation certainly may or may not change according to these climate model forecasts. So big trends in terms of water levels, in terms of climate, but also here's just a map animated showing the shift in technologies according to Kansas water use data. Each of the dots on the map is an individual producer and with the technology that they used in that particular year shaded. So I think this should loop through. Initially, it starts out with mostly flood and then high pressure center pivot systems. And then you can see that those high pressure systems in particular became replaced by what we've called LIPA in general, but it's just lower pressure drop pipe type systems. And then gradually also flood has declined as either the people having them gave up the water right, or they've replaced them with newer technology. So irrigation technology changes rapidly. This isn't to mention a whole host of other changes that are occurring across the system in ways that are really variable in space and time. And those include water use restrictions, some of them that, as Don mentioned earlier, are really what you would consider a grassroots organized type of restriction that attempts to address future water availability using current practice today. Obviously, interstate compacts is a familiar issue to many of the folks here in the audience. And then things that global and regional forces that are leading to shifts in crop choice. Obviously, the price of corn is a huge one. The recent price increases in beef responding to both availability of supply, but also reflecting a broader demand trend as much as more of the globe is I guess, becoming capable and desiring to have different types of crops and different types of livestock production. So there's a whole host of changes, and that's one of the reasons that we became interested. Obviously, I'm from Michigan State, so I'm a little bit out of town. What happened was the National Science Foundation put out a call called Water Sustainability and Climate in 2010. And we sat down, Dave Heineman and myself sat down and said, where in the world, because we certainly, we're not necessarily limited in the United States, but where in the world are the issues related to water, sustainability, and climate most apparent right now? Where are the trends most interesting, and where do we have the data to run a synthesis project? And there really wasn't anything other than the high plains that came to us. The Central Valley of California is a huge irrigation water user, but in many, many ways, they were fundamentally unsustainable from the outset. Whereas the high plains has places that are truly sustainable in the sense of recharge roughly matching pumping, but also places that are probably quite unsustainable, okay? So that gradient and the data availability really made this attractive. So what we proposed to do was bring together a series of systems models that predict the response of climate change to land surface processes, models that predict how the land surface itself will respond to climate variability, models that account for how crops will respond to climate and soil moisture. And then also bringing together economic models that attempt to describe how new technologies might be produced. When we looked at the literature in this region, there was a very large high plains study that was done back in the late 1970s. And a subsequent review about a decade later showed that the study had some really sound science, great predictions, but the predictions were all fundamentally wrong because they assumed that as more efficient irrigation technologies became available, that farmers would actually use less water. When, of course, any ag sociologist would say, well, no, that's not what they would choose to do. They would choose to irrigate more acres because if there's a cap on total water withdrawal, they're going to use all that water. And so we wanted to make sure that we also brought in people who would be, who would help us to construct scenarios that would maybe be a little bit more robust looking forward. So we call this the Coupled Landscape, Atmospheric, and Socioeconomic Systems, or CLASS project. We wanted to have a pronounceable acronym for our proposal, and who knows whether or not that was a good idea. The work that I'm going to be talking about is this little box right here today. It's the surface and groundwater hydrology component. We used to call it the Integrated Landscape Hydrology Model. We've dropped the I just because there's fewer letters to try and mix up now. But there's certainly a lot of other aspects of this modeling, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it as well. Our team also, once we decided the High Plains is the place to go, we started talking with the folks at Kansas Geological Survey. And because being right situated on the High Plains, or well, at least adjacent to it and actively engaged in High Plains research, they were ideal partners to get involved with. So we have a very large team from both Kansas Geological Survey as well as from Michigan State, and professors spanning everything from hydrology to agronomy, and then climate economics and sociology as well. And then tons of graduate students and undergraduates as well. So moving on to the piece of it that I'm going to focus on, the landscape hydrology model component. I'm not going to describe a huge amount of detail about the model. I mean, obviously, I'd be really happy to. I wrote the model in much of it. But basically, this cartoon shows the landscape as idealized here, the various fluxes of water and movement of water across the system. And what it was, I developed the surface components of this model in response to a need that was really went unfilled at the time, which was we had ModFlow for doing groundwater modeling, and it was very widely used, but there were very few tools available back in 2007 when I started this that would allow us to predict what was coming in as recharge. There were very large regional groundwater models being constructed with one number for recharge, and that one number across space and time obviously doesn't reflect what is a hugely dynamic process. So we developed this model. We decided rather than having a system that would replace ModFlow, we'd actually just use ModFlow for the groundwater component, which allowed us to use a huge number of legacy models, as well as benefit from the continued development that the USGS and others and its partners are undergoing with respect to ModFlow, and as we heard from Steve, they've also moved in a very similar direction by adding on these surface components from other models. The particular instance of LHM that I'm going to be talking about is a model that's focused on the Central High Plains region. So starting here where the Canadian River divides the Ogallala Aquifer from the Southern High Plains, all the way up to about central Kansas, where there's a similar convenient kind of narrow point in the aquifer to draw a line. So these divisions have been widely used since about the early 1990s. The actual model boundary is shown in this black rectangle. We've extended it beyond the Central High Plains because in eastern Kansas and in central Oklahoma, there's a large network of atmospheric research and monitoring sites maintained by the DOE that we want to use to help us when we move to coupling our surface model with the climate model a little bit later in the project. So it's a fairly large region, 385,000 square kilometers. Apologize for not having that in square miles. Most of the rest of my talk here, I have more familiar units with 1 square kilometer cells. So quite a large domain with relatively fine description or grid. In order to work in this region, we initially had developed the model for use in the Great Lakes Basin, where there's not a great deal of irrigation. We needed to develop a new irrigation module. And as we started talking with people, with farmers, we sort of assumed that there was a common practice related to irrigation. And we found that there is no common practice. The only commonality among practice is that everyone does it differently. Obviously, the goal is to make the soil wetter so that the crops aren't stressed. But beyond that, there was no generalizable scheme that we could input into this model to function over this very large domain. So rather than talking about irrigation water use, and at this moment, I want to think about irrigation water demand, because what we've done is we've taken a map of what areas are irrigated. This one's a little bit old at 1992, but the more recent maps don't show a huge change in total irrigation acreage. There's been some fine details where things have shifted in specific areas. But this is also very high resolution data, which is nice. It shows individual pivots rather than blocky grid cells. So we've designed this to be triggered automatically. We've defined it at the moment. This particular model uses once soil moisture reaches 33% of plant available water, defined as the difference between like the drained upper limit and the lower limit of the soil, then it's irrigated. I've prescribed a certain amount of irrigation, 2 inches, to be applied at a little less than 1 inch per hour. And then then it waits for a user-defined amount of time before irrigating again. And so the simulations I've shown waited for 7 days after this irrigation event. So in this way, the model is dynamic in the sense that it can respond to changes in precipitation both prior to the growing season as well as during the growing season itself. Respond to changes in plant growth as reflected by other input data I'll show you in a second, and also respond to changes in broader shifts in climate that would drive evapotranspirative demand. So the model requires a host of different input types. And one of my favorite to talk about and one of my favorite to look at is the soil survey data. Starting in the 60s, the USDA and the NRCS, or its precursor, went through a process of creating high-resolution or relatively high-resolution soil maps across the entire US, and then digitize those into the Surgo database. It's a wonderful database. We've seen some pictures just a few talks ago. The trouble is the database doesn't actually tell you too much about how the soils actually behave hydrologically, and so we have to take a step beyond just here's the soil textural description and then turn that into hydrologic parameters. So that's something I have personally spent quite a bit of time doing. And from that, we get really what I think is probably the most data intensive and richest single data set available to us in the hydrologic sciences community. The number of man hours reflected in this map, in the underlying drawing of the individual polygons, the field verification that said that yes, this is this soil series, was really just unmatched by anything else that we see available. So it's really a fantastic data set, and we're really happy to use it. It's also an extremely important driver to the model, so it's great to get something so high quality. Another prime input is leaf area index, which reflects the crop biomass. So we get, since 2000, NASA has 2 satellites with what's a sensor called MODIS that measures leaf area index, and they put out a product every 8 days. So we get, here's just one map from the 3rd of July in 2010. And in this, you can clearly see where higher leaf area index, it means more vegetation. You can clearly see where there's irrigation going on in the western and central portions. This very closely resembles the map that you saw here. And the model is very sensitive to leaf area index in order to predict evapotranspiration. And then we use things like precipitation, air temperature, relative humidity. And what we've chosen for that is to use a somewhat coarse data set relative to these other ones, but it's a fusion of model predictions in order to interpolate between climate gauging stations, weather gauges. And that allows us to have a consistent product through both space and time. So the specific simulation I'm running and showing you today is going to be focused just on the central high plains, not the whole model domain. I'm using 7 years of data. 3 of those years, the initial 3 were fairly normal in terms of precipitation over the central high plains, about 22 inches a year. And then there's two years of pretty deep drought in the central high plains, averaging about 17 inches a year. And then a recovery from that drought since. And then I'm running one particular climate change scenario I'll show you, but I wanted to give you a better idea of what these climate scenarios look like. So if you take these 24 different models, you average across all of them, and then plot out their temperature change as a function of time, there's 4 different scenarios ranging from this 2.6 scenario to the 8.5 that show that, and this is for the entire High Plains aquifer, this is an average across the entire region. The predicted temperature changes range from about 1 degree above 2000 temperature to about 5.5, and this is degrees Celsius, so you multiply that by 1.8. So to get to Fahrenheit. So what we're doing is we've chosen the RCP6 scenario because it kind of resembles, like I said, the business as usual case, and then we're running an end of century scenario to get sensitivity. So the 3 analyses I'll show you will be our baseline scenario, current day climate, looking at some drought impacts, comparing a 2-year normal period versus a 2-year dry period, and then a climate change impacts, looking at that 7-year average of the climate change forecast versus the 7-year average of the baseline. And for this particular model, we haven't done any site-specific calibration because at this point I'm just focused on the surface. I haven't added any groundwater component to this particular model. And the eventual validation, once we do run the groundwater components as well, will include water levels, stream flows, like you saw earlier in Steve's talk, as well as things like soil moisture data and leaf area index as well, because we'll be predicting that with our crop growth model. And and the groundwater simulation coming soon. The groundwater part, by the way, is the single most intensive part of any of this model development. It's really, we're benefiting a lot from the work of others who have developed the models for the regions we're interested in. So I'm going to show you evapotranspiration, and this is really the only time I'm going to focus on it. It is the primary part of the water budget. I'll show you a plot of that in just a minute. And it's got a really strong gradient. The gradient reflects the gradient of precipitation. This is an annual map. Okay, it's an average of that 7-year period. And basically what it reflects is there's about twice as much precipitation on the eastern portion of the Central High Plains in Kansas than there is the western portion in northwest Texas there, or in the northwest part of the Texas Panhandle. Also, the irrigated areas are clearly visible. So this baseline scenario has irrigation as applied active. And so you can clearly see in areas that should otherwise have relatively low ET, there's both high leaf area index, so high biomass, as well as high water availability. So a significant amount of ET in those areas as well. Groundwater recharge is something that's really very interesting. Coming from a humid region, it's a little disconcerting to look at a prediction of groundwater recharge and see that the number is 0 in my model. And because in very large areas, the number is effectively 0 for the amount of recharge coming from, say, a dry land, a dry grass cell. But this map shows total recharge that includes not just the upland areas, but also the wetland areas as well. Because the vast majority, as we heard earlier, the vast majority of the recharge in the region comes from ephemeral wetland features, playa lakes, draws, things like that, that when there is water available, there's the ability for that water to infiltrate into the soil. Also, much of the western portion of the Central High Plains doesn't have effective connectivity with surface water, so much of the water is actually retained in local drainage. And so the wetland recharge is really what the model is most sensitive to. So we're seeing that within the model, and it's pretty encouraging. The numbers, we haven't started comparing, quantitatively with other model predictions and data predictions, but we're seeing things that are within the realm of reasonability, which we're pretty happy to see. So as I mentioned, the model's dynamic. It actually runs every hour and makes a prediction about every cell in the model. But of course, hourly is maybe a little bit too much data to look at. So here's just looking at yearly averages, or yearly averages across the Central High Plains region. How much water went into evapotranspiration, runoff, and recharge. So runoff is a significant portion of the overall water budget in this area, again, including the wetland areas as well. And what you can see is groundwater recharge is a relatively small part of the overall budget, especially in years where there's drought. So the groundwater recharge is a threshold process. You need to have enough water available to overcome the soil's ability to hold on to it. So in drought years, that recharge basically shuts off entirely. So this is pretty interesting to see that dynamic response. So the model also then, of course, will predict for us irrigation demand. And here's a map showing irrigation demand. One of the interesting things, I put in a hard limit for this particular model. You couldn't apply more than 14 inches. Basically, I didn't want the model to just go crazy and produce as much as it wanted. And I'll relax some of those assumptions a little bit later. But what I see in this is depending on soil type, the behavior is fairly binary. Either there's essentially irrigating right up to the limit, or irrigating just a few inches, just enough to provide the water necessary for the biomass that's on that cell. And we haven't differentiated crop type, but rather just biomass is inferred from leaf area index. And again, it's really strongly controlled by those hydraulic properties of the soil, so we better make sure we're doing a good job of characterizing those, because we certainly can't really calibrate those over this kind of scale. Then we can also look at return flow from irrigation. It's something that is highly variable, but under the practice that we've specified here, which is spray irrigation, 2 inches per event, we do get a significant amount of return flow, and that's important, as mentioned earlier, to the overall water budget. And then we'll look at the impacts of drought. So this is the map that I'm showing here is taking the recharge in this case for the years 2011 and 2012, and then subtracting that from the baseline case. So negative numbers indicate less groundwater recharge. So what you see is essentially the groundwater recharge is very strongly impacted in the areas where there's the most available, which is exactly what we'd expect. But the declines are pretty much uniform. There are some areas where there's a little bit more recharge, but that's very likely just due to a little variability in the climate data set. So significant impacts on recharge, and as you saw in the time series, reductions of about 50 to 60%. And the impacts are greater where there is more recharge available. The drought also has an impact on irrigation. As you might expect, it increases the demand for irrigation. But interestingly enough, the model predicted total amount of water used is lower because the actual crop biomass was lower. So this doesn't reflect actual practice, but because the biomass was lower, the yields were lower, the actual predicted crop water demand was lower, even though the more crops, more acreage needed more significant amounts of irrigation. So there's some really interesting dynamic patterns that are brought about by the need for more water due to reduced precipitation from drought. And this 14-inch limit also is hit in many more cases. So that limit is actually something that comes into play more often in drought. So then looking just at one single climate scenario, this RCP 6.0 scenario for the end of the century, this is the precipitation anomaly. I'll just use the word anomaly here. It just means the change from the baseline condition. So showing that in the eastern portion of the aquifer, there's the average annual precip in this scenario is about 1.5 inches lower than current, or 4 centimeters lower, and then just under an inch lower on the eastern or on the western edge of the Central High Plains. So, and this is something that it doesn't just change on an annual basis, it actually changes on a monthly basis. And there is a shift in seasonality, though the region receives almost all of its precipitation coincidentally during the growing season, or the prior month and following couple months. So this also has an impact on recharge. And interestingly, the pattern is very, very similar to what we see under drought, which kind of makes sense because the important thing is what's the balance between precipitation and evapotranspirative demand. But the response to the climate change scenario is about an order of magnitude less than the response to drought. So it suggests an interesting kind of interplay that climate change will have an important impact. But maybe the sort of gross changes, the mean annual air temperature changes, aren't as big of a factor as what might happen to the cyclic behavior of droughts in the region. And that's something that scientists there's not a lot of agreement on. It's definitely an active area of research and something that could have huge implications if we're looking at more frequent droughts as opposed to just deeper droughts that occur at the same intervals because of this really order of magnitude difference in terms of overall impact. And then irrigation demand is also augmented under climate change. One thing I do want to mention, the leaf area index, in this case, I had hoped to use a dynamic leaf area index model that works just great in Michigan. And I went and I tried it here and it was terrible because the farmer planting and management decisions, everything is very different. There's multiple peaks in leaf area index across the region. So I've left leaf area index unchanged. So this doesn't really reflect the longer growing season. But in studies that we've done elsewhere, it shows that the longer growing season actually would increase the irrigation demand even more. So conclusions and next steps, that the climate change scenarios help us to quantify the regional impacts or possible regional impacts. And we are running a range of scenarios. I just showed you one here today. And I really am looking at incorporating a dynamic plant response. I'd hope to do it the easy way through a simple model, but we'll actually have to move into a more dynamic plant growth model. And looking at running some long-term historical scenarios as well, trying to get back to pre-development conditions. The irrigation module is behaving properly in the sense that the dynamics are okay, but we do need to work to refine the application strategies to get them to match overall irrigation totals. And one of the things that we're focusing on is really trying to advance the resolution and capabilities, both in space and time, of predicting groundwater recharge. Because if we want to understand how to manage this resource, it's really our key input variable. So, thanks.
At the expense of your lunchtime, you're allowed to ask a couple of questions if you'd like.
Yeah.
I'm at Saddles. Could you explain more about why you choose the specific scenario of RCP6?
Yeah, so RCP6 looks, there's two reasons. One is that there's been a lot of, across many different disciplines, there's been a lot of analysis using the prior generation of IPCC scenarios. The A1B scenario is most commonly used. The RCP scenario looks a lot like, or the 6.0 looks a lot like the A1B. They're almost identical in terms of their overall temperature change. But also, the emissions pathway for 6.0 looks the most similar to what we've seen over the last decade and prior. So it's matches what we're doing right now. And obviously, what we're doing 80 years from now could be very different from that, but it's a good starting point for this analysis.
Okay, so you actually compare rates the last decade?
Yes. Yeah.
In one of your earlier pictures, you had a map of the aquifer and kind of narrowing in the western part of Kansas what comes up, what comes from Nebraska. Because of the depletions that have taken place south, in your opinion, how does that affect the portion of the aquifer in Nebraska?
You mean, how does groundwater use in Kansas impact water resources in Nebraska? I'm not in a good position to answer it just because I haven't looked specifically. I mean, just from a bulk water balance standpoint, it's not a regionally important flow, but locally it could certainly be important, and that's, I haven't looked and zoomed in close enough to really ask that question, answer it. Sorry, I'd like to comment on it, but I don't want to mislead or anything. Yeah.
Just real quick, I wondered, you mentioned the leaf area index didn't work so well for forecasting.
Yeah.
Input, and wondering, does your land cover information include the difference between the one and peak season grass cover areas?
I mean, it doesn't explicitly account for differences in how those crops behave in terms of their water use. But the leaf area index data, at least in undercurrent, would reflect the growth, as good of a model as LAI is. So to answer your question, there's not fine level differences in different species of grass or corn or soy or whatever. But hydrologically, the crops do tend to behave all fairly similarly, provided that you know what their leaf area index is fairly accurately. So at least for baseline, we've got a good idea. And the forecast is something that we're definitely working on with more dynamic crop models to try and refine that.
Very good.
Thank you.